lovelies, it's Miss City Lace here on my Pinup Glamour channel and Pinup Glamour podcast, and today we are going to be talking about some vintage terminology to do with vintage fashion and vintage fashion shopping. If you're a long-time glamorous friend, welcome back. If you're new here, I share topics and tutorials on pinup burlesque and the glamorous lifestyle. If these are all things you love, be sure to subscribe as I share new videos and podcasts every week. If you're tuning in from YouTube, you can see I'm actually filming in my wardrobe today, and this is only a very small portion of all the items I own. So you can see I'm a very big vintage clothing lover, and today's video we're going to be chatting about terminology when you're looking for your own vintage clothing. One of the biggest questions I get asked about vintage fashion is where I source the items that I wear, and a lot of it I do actually source in person from vintage markets and vintage stores, antique stores and places like this. If your area doesn't have this availability, it's definitely worth checking online. If you look at Instagram, there's tons of pages that have items for sale, as well as websites like Etsy and eBay and Facebook groups as well. In the last few years, I've covered a range of topics from a vintage shopping kit to how to identify a true vintage item and many other topics, but I'm probably going to redo these videos and update them with more current information and the knowledge that I've learned since creating these. I thought today's video with defining some terminology would be a really great foundation for those who are looking to get into wearing more vintage clothing, or for those who have a good understanding but maybe want to rehash some of those important details to help them along the way. Firstly, we'll look at the broad terminology we hear quite regularly. So there's vintage, antique, and retro. We're going to break these down and what they mean. Starting with vintage, something we are probably most interested in. When we're talking about a vintage item, this is an item that is 40 years or older. The time bracket that we usually classify this is from 40 to 99 years. So this could be an item made as recently as in 1983 or as early as 1924. Our next category of antique is an item that is 100 years or older. Looking back from 1923 and earlier, this is what we would classify as an antique item of clothing or accessory. When we start to look at antique items, quite often these are very fragile and maybe not as easily worn every day. Even our 1950s clothing is getting older and older, so we're definitely seeing items age and the wear and tear that comes from this. Over time, fabric degrades and breaks down. Even the threads in some of my vintage items have become very fragile and brittle, so I do a lot of repairs and maintenance to make sure this is still a wearable item. That's with my vintage. I wouldn't say I wear a lot of antique clothing at all. I have a few antique accessories, but it's definitely something you need to be a little bit more careful with. Our next term is retro, which generally means imitating another era, quite often in our modern times. Some related terminology would be vintage style or vintage reproduction. It's really important when you're shopping online, or if you are advertising an item yourself, you're able to identify which of these categories applies best to this, and to either look at this and know it is that, or to advertise what you have correctly. When we're vintage shopping, two key words we want to see together are the words true and vintage. When an item is true vintage, it means it is from that era. So I'm wearing a 1950s blouse today. It is true vintage from that era. If you're out and about at a vintage market and you find a obviously modern vintage blouse, it's advertised as true vintage or vintage from the 1950s, you can quite easily identify that may not be correct, or the person selling that item might not be aware of the correct terminology here. There's no restrictions with your wardrobe though. I do not personally wear exclusively true vintage clothing. It is just not a possibility for me, but some people do like to do this. Some people are like me and like to wear a mix of modern and true vintage, and others wear exclusively our vintage style, our retro, our vintage reproduction style clothing. If you are looking for more of the modern brands, I would recommend just checking out Instagram and looking at the hashtag pinup clothing, pinup, and finding related items to that, just to find what you personally identify with and what fits within your budget. Within this, I would be wary of extremely cheap clothing items. There's a lot of rather ill-made clothing that you can find online. And quite often when you order it from the website, it will not arrive looking like the picture. So it's definitely worth checking out reviews and contacting pinup friends to see what they think of a company. Going back to our vintage shopping though, when we're looking at our terminology, so we're looking vintage, true vintage, antique. There are lots of other terms though we may come across online or in person. The first terminology is dead stock or NOS, which stands for new old stock. This more often than not references an item that has been found which has not been sold, it's been not owned before, not worn. It's quite often with tags, it can be new in box as well. But it should definitely have no signs of wear and tear like other items. A lot of vintage shoppers really look out for these types of items because they want new items that are in pristine condition. A related term to this would be NWT, which is new with tags. This is an item that may not have been found as a dead stock item. It may have been bought by someone and just left to hang up in their closet with the tags on, because who hasn't done that before? Having an item with the original hang tags is really cool because you get that really cool piece of history that breaks down a little bit more about that item. Like dead stock, new with tags quite often hasn't been worn and has a greater chance of being in a better condition. Do keep in mind though, it may have deterioration just over time, and that's just through the breakdown of the fabric or threads and other items, and may not actually be a result of the item being worn. Our next piece of terminology I see all the time, and this is when it says as is. Quite often this will list some flaws or something wrong with the item, which means it's sold as is. So it's not in perfect condition, it may need a hole repaired, a seam repaired, or something like that. It may have a stain or something else. So if you can't see what is wrong with the item, do chat to the shopkeeper or the online store about what's wrong with the item to determine if it's something you're happy with or something you can repair quite easily. Now, I'm someone who has a lot of items that I buy that need repairs, and I would advise you to, unless you've got the time and you know you're going to do it, maybe pass on that item, even if it is a bit cheaper. Just it's so easy to accumulate so much stuff. You say, oh, I'll repair that one day, I'll alter that one day, I'll take that in, or I'll let it out. And quite often that never happens and you end up giving it away anyway. So I think it's always worth considering with those sorts of items if it's something you're willing to do. The last bit of terminology we'll be talking today is the one we'll probably see quite regularly, and this is in good worn condition. This is a true vintage piece of clothing which has clearly been worn. It may have discoloration under the armpits, it may have some wear and tear. This is similar to the as is condition, but it is usually in a better condition than this. It's very wearable, but it's obvious that it's been worn by someone previously. There are many elements and terminologies that can relate to vintage shopping, but I thought I'd create a small and concise list today to help those at the beginning of their journey or those who may just be interested in hearing about these. I truly hope you've enjoyed today's video and maybe found it a little bit useful too. If you have, be sure to like and comment on this video as it really helps me out, and be sure to follow and rate this podcast if you're listening in from Spotify, as these are all things that help me grow in these avenues. If you'd like early access to my content, I do have my Glamour community on Patreon. I'd like to thank all my patrons, but especially my VIP Glamour patrons and Burlesque Glamour students. The support you give me truly helps me in creating more for you here on YouTube and Spotify. To follow my daily pinup adventures, I post super regularly to Instagram and TikTok. Simply follow @MissLadyLace and be sure to drop me a message so I can follow you back too. To never miss out on my vintage fun, be sure to subscribe, and I'll be seeing you all very soon. Stay glamorous!